So for this week, our ticket in the door is just a brainstorm. So if you want to pause the video real quick, just to do a little bit of brainstorming, I want you to think about how you would define instructional coaching. You've already done some reading about some things, but how would you personally define instructional coaching? Just think about that. Like I said, if you want to pause, go right ahead. Moving on, our agenda for this week, we're going to talk about instructional coaching. We're going to talk about the types of coaching. There are actually 3 different types. Then I'm going to introduce the coaching cycle to you, and we're going to talk about using data within a student-centered coaching approach, because that's ultimately where we should be working all of the time. And then I will discuss the 2 coaching assignments at the end, so you can start thinking about them. Okay, so our learning targets for this week. I can discuss the differences between the types of coaching and when I may engage in each one, because you will vary, but go between the 3. I can describe the coaching cycle. That's really key, that you really get a hold of that. And then I can articulate the impact of student-centered coaching. Okay, so instructional coaching. Now I'm going to keep saying instructional coaching because even though this course is preparing you to be a literacy coach, there are times that a literacy coach is called to do coaching in other content areas. For example, if you're in a middle or a high school, you might have to go into work with like a social studies classroom teacher or a science or a math to build in content literacy. Right? There's content area literacy, but you're going to end up coaching some of that content as well. It's just the nature of that beast. So anyway, so most people don't really know what it looks like when they do what they do, which is funny. If you were to ask somebody who's been coaching for many years, they might have a hard time articulating what it is that they do. So I just want you to think about your own definition of what instructional coaching is. If you don't have that written somewhere just for your own note-taking to come back to later, pause the video now to just jot it down, and so you can come back to it later, or if you need a minute to really think purposely about or intentionally about what your definitions of instructional coaching might involve, be sure to pause right now and really think about that. So ultimately what instructional coaching is, first and foremost, it's a partnership, and that is so important to remember. All too often, coaching relationships are ruined, sometimes even before they get started, because someone will communicate this idea like the coach is coming in to fix the teacher, or the coach is coming in as more knowledgeable than the teacher. That's not the case. It's truly a partnership where the coach and the teacher work together towards some goal. It's really important to remember that. It's also about bringing what we know about best practice or evidence-based practices into the classroom. So again, not fixing a teacher, but just to say, hey, there are some other approaches maybe you've forgotten about. We all get into our groove, like we use the same strategies over and over because they're comfortable. Well, what coaching does is kind of help you get outside of that that narrow lens and bring in more best practices into your daily teaching. Ultimately, while it feels very much like focusing on the teaching, it really is about student learning and student achievement. Really what coaching is meant to do is increase or maximize student learning, maximize student engagement while building teacher capacity. Right? Like you're not going to really improve student learning without doing something with that teacher, but the goal can't end with the teacher. We have to always keep students as our end goal when coaching. Again, it is not at all about fixing people or fixing teachers, I should say. It really is ongoing in classroom professional development so teachers can learn new things or tweak ideas, implement them right in their own classroom, all the while still focusing on maximizing student learning. That's a really important mindset to have around coaching. And one final thing to think about, it's important to remember, if we do the thinking for others, they're going to resist. So if you go into a classroom and say you observe a teacher doing guided reading and you say, I really think you could group your students differently. Why don't you try it this way? That's not going to be very well received. Right? Whereas if you were to ask questions, how do you think this went? How do you think the groupings worked for you? Are you meeting all your students' needs? If you guide the teacher to make that decision or arrive at that conclusion on their own, then it's their decision, as it should be. It's their classroom, right? We can't come in as a coach and impose our thinking. We can just guide teachers to change their thinking. And sometimes people have a hard time with it because it sounds a little manipulative. It's not meant to be. It's really meant to just help teachers do that thinking for themselves, because that's what's sustainable. Once the coach leaves the classroom, we want that teacher to continue that kind of thinking, right? It's not just when we're there in the classroom. Okay, so there are 3 types of coaching. The first is teacher-centered coaching, all focused on the teacher. The second is student-centered coaching, all focused on students. And the third is relationship-driven coaching, all focused on building a relationship with the teacher. So you've read about those things. Think now for a minute, which one of those, or more than one maybe, which would impact student learning the most and why? Pause the video, think about that, jot down your ideas, because we're going to come back to it. Okay, now that you've done your thinking, this is just a nice visual by Diane Sweeney from her website. It's actually in a couple of her books too. That shows the difference between student-centered, teacher-centered, relationship-driven coaching. And what I like is it breaks down, like, what is the role of each of those things? What should the focus be in each of those things? Because they're all different. How is data used in each one? Again, very different. You can see nothing is the same except for the role of relationships. So you will never just work in one type. You will go back and forth between types. It can depend on so many different things, but I want you to think, why would your work as a coach kind of ebb and flow across these modalities? Think about it for a minute. If you're working with, say, 4 teachers, first of all, that's 4 different personalities, right? 4 different needs. You might have to spend more time in relationship-driven coaching for some of them versus others. Some might take a little bit longer to establish that trust that you need to engage in coaching. Some teachers will be, they'll jump right in and have their students on their minds, and that's awesome. You can go right to student-centered. Some teachers, you are going to have to focus a little bit more on the teacher's practices. But just because you're starting in a place doesn't mean you're going to stay there, right? We should always be pushing towards student-centered coaching. That is always what our goal should be. Understanding, though, that there are times that we're going to have to go back to teacher-centered, or we're going to have to go back to relationship-driven coaching. You can't ever really stay in one place. Does that make sense? I like this visual because it really does show something that I always struggled with the most as a coach was where to spend my time. And sometimes I would feel like, man, there's just this one teacher and he or she just needs so much help around whatever, but they're so resistant. And I would spend so much time and energy trying to get into that classroom and trying to impact that student's or that teacher's teaching and student learning. And what that did was take away so much of my time from other people who might have been more open to coaching. So it's really important to think about our spheres of control. If you look, I love this visual because it shows how much you actually can control. You really can only control what you do, right? You can't control other people. You can influence other people, and that's what coaching is. It's having an influence on other people. So that's the blue spot, what you can influence. Everything beyond that is outside of your control and influence. And that means we're going to have teachers that are in that purple, that they are just outside of our influence because they don't want to be influenced. They're closed off. They're not ready to engage in coaching. So if they're in the purple, it's not worth your time, right? We only have a finite amount of time. It's important to think about what we absolutely have control over, which is ourselves and our work and how we schedule our work, and then the teachers who are ready to be influenced by our work. this was something that just, it took so long for me to really understand because, or not understand, it took me a long time to come to that realization, because I think a lot of us go into coaching understanding that when you work with teachers, you impact so many more students, but not everybody is just going to be so open to that. So I just like to share this as kind of a check, like think about where you're spending your time, because otherwise you could really be spinning your wheels. All right, let's move on to the coaching cycle then. So there are different visuals. This is a very typical one that actually we use in this region to train teachers who are like mentor teachers. The BOCES will often do new teacher or mentor teacher training for anybody who is a mentor to a new teacher in all of the different districts. And this is kind of the training that they use. So you can see coaching is a cycle, right? It's not linear. There's not a start and an end point. It's iterative. It constantly goes through this cycle where it really starts out with goal setting. And then once you set a goal, you kind of learn about it, like you do a little bit of research. You do some observation for the purpose of collecting data. And then once you do all that, then you reflect, right? And once you reflect, you set a new goal. And then you learn more about the new goal. And you can see you're just going to keep going through this with a teacher over and over again. Makes sense, right? So if we're thinking about the coaching cycle, in regards to those 3 roles of literacy coach. So let's first start with teacher-centered coaching. Remember, teacher-centered coaching, we're always going to be focused on what the teacher is doing. So let's say we were going to set a goal with that teacher to help them. Maybe the teacher said, I really want to improve how I do guided reading. You will hear that a lot as a literacy coach. So your goal, improve guided reading. So your learn phase would be to meet with the teacher and talk about, what do you do for guided reading? Hearing it from the teacher, not you defining it for them, hearing from the teacher. You're learning, right? So you're asking questions. Then you move on to observed or collect data. So that's when you go and observe a guided reading lesson and you take some notes down about what you see, all in relation to the goal. You're never going to collect data that is not related to the goal, even though that can be tempting sometimes. And then you get to reflect. You meet with the teacher again. You provide your feedback around what you saw. You ask them questions. How do you think that it went? Where opportunities that you see you can grow around? And then you offer suggestions. And those suggestions then are going to help you to engage in your next cycle, your next goal. That makes sense, right? All focused on that teacher's instructional practices within guided reading. Okay? Let's now look at relationship-driven coaching. So let's say your goal was to get a teacher to allow you to model a lesson for them. I definitely have had this goal more times than I can count. Because if it's a teacher that you'll hear things like, oh, my students would never engage in Socratic seminar, or no, a flipped instruction, that would never work for my students. So when you say, well, can I model how it would look so you can watch the students' reactions? I think that's very powerful for teachers, but sometimes it takes some time getting there. So let's say that was your goal, to allow or to get the teacher to allow you to come in and model a lesson. Well, your learn phase would be to get to know that teacher as a person. We can't forget that we're working with people. They're not just teachers, right? We have to talk to people. We have to establish relationships that are just beyond professional relationships, right? And then we have to get to know what their style is. We have to know what their style of teaching is so we know how to frame what it is that we're trying to bring to the table, right? So then our observe and collect data would be to observe their instruction. We can't just go by what they tell us. If we happen to pass a teacher in the hallway or they're talking to us at a faculty meeting and they say, oh yeah, I do flipped instruction all the time. Well, everybody might define it a little bit differently. So we actually have to get in there and observe, right? And then the reflection part, remember, if we're staying in relationship-driven coaching, you would have to start with offering positive feedback, admiring what they do well, pointing out what they're doing well, and then bring resources that could help their instruction. There's so much value in sharing, just bringing resources. Something that I used to do a lot to get into teachers' classrooms would be if I heard them talking or I observed them doing a unit on, I don't know, say World War II, like reading text from World War II, I would go and find as much as I could in different genres, political cartoons, propaganda, letters, whatever I could. And I'd combine them and I'd stop by and I'd say, oh my gosh, I heard you were doing this unit. I came across these resources that I think you would find so valuable. That teacher is going to then say, huh, that coach brings some value to the table. I could get on board with that. And that's going to help establish a relationship. So that's very often your most resistant teachers, where you have to start with relationship-driven coaching. Bringing resources is a perfect place to start. I'm telling you, it works. Okay, but the third, remember, we're always striving for student-centered coaching, right? So let's look at what those stages look like. So when you're setting a goal, it has to be a goal for the students in relationship to the standards. Everything in student-centered coaching has to be anchored in the standards, because if it's anchored in what you observe, then it becomes your opinion. And it can't be about you. It has to be about, ultimately, what are we getting students to get to? Mastering the standards, right? If all teaching has to be focused on the standards, then that means all of our goals for teachers and students have to be focused on the standards. So at stage one, that goal has to be in relation to the standards. Stage two, you're going to want to assess students to determine their performance against that standard. Where are they in relation to the standard? Now, that could be just looking at something that the teacher has already collected, like work already collected. It could be you sitting in the classroom watching students perform tasks or have a discussion around a certain standard. That can look a ton of different ways, which is something you would agree on with your teacher ahead of time. Stage three, that would involve the teacher, or you if you're modeling, implementing instruction that meets students' needs. So whatever the needs were that came out of this assessment, then you're going to teach, right? Just like the instruction assessment cycle. You got to teach them to meet those needs. And then when that teaching is done, you have to reassess, just like we would in our regular teaching, right? Did students meet that goal? Yes? Awesome. No? What else can we do? And then go back to stage one to set a goal again. It might be keeping the same goal and tweaking it a tiny bit, maybe because the instructional strategy didn't work, or if students mastered it, awesome. It might be setting a higher goal or moving on to something different. But again, it's still that same process, still this iterative cycle of coaching, but for student-centered coaching, everything is focused on the standards. Cycle, it doesn't really matter what type of coaching you're engaging in, but as you're getting ready to start a cycle, you have to think about your beliefs and your vision for coaching, because those drive everything that you do. You can't just say, oh yeah, I know what my beliefs are, and then jump into it. You actually have to define them. That's why I asked you to write them down. I do have a method to my madness. It's because you have to be able to articulate why you're asking somebody to do what you're asking them to do, because they're going to ask you, why do I have to do this? So it's important to think about those things really purposely, have them written down. Then you're going to reflect on your own beliefs and vision and plan for your initial conversation. You're not ever going to just jump into a conversation with a teacher. You need to do a little due diligence at first and think about, okay, what am I going to get out of this first conversation? Where do I hope to go with this teacher? Sometimes it'll go your way and sometimes it won't. And that's okay, as long as you're anchored in and staying true to your beliefs and your vision for coaching. And then keep in mind during that initial meeting, what you want to do is come to an agreement. It can't ever be, you're never imposing anything on a teacher, right? Coaching has to be, it's a partnership. So you have to come to an agreement with the teacher on what your focus is for that learning or coaching cycle, how you're going to work together. Clearly define, are you going to co-teach a lesson? Are you going to model and they're going to observe? Are they going to teach and you're going to observe? Clearly articulate how you are working together. Are you even co-planning the lesson? Are you going to analyze the assessment data together? And then if you are going to co-plan, how are you going to approach it? Is it going to be that the teacher plans and then you get together afterward to kind of talk it out and see if anything can be adjusted? Or are you both truly planning from scratch together? Again, that can look a ton of different ways. But in that first meeting, these things have to very clearly be established. Documenting is key for a coaching cycle. So there are a couple of things to think about. First of all, when we think about, sometimes people will say, well, how long could a coaching cycle take? It seems kind of quick, right? You meet, you go observe, you look at assessment data, you meet again to reflect. It does sound quickly, but typically one coaching cycle could take 4 to 6 weeks. It's all going to depend on how often you're meeting with teachers and how many teachers you're working with. There should definitely be a minimum of 1 weekly planning conversation to within that coaching cycle to look at student work, because you're not going to want to look at work just one time. You're going to want to look at a couple of pieces of work to see, are students really on track? Are they really meeting the goals? And then am I able to really co-plan instruction? And then, now this is ideal, it doesn't always happen, but ideally you want to be co-teaching in the classroom 1 to 3 times a week. Again, that's ideal. I can't say I ever got to that, but I was stretched far too thin across too many different districts. Had I been in one district, in one school, I probably would have been able to achieve that. But having that kind of like a goal or a framework in mind is helpful to know how many times you should be meeting with a teacher. There are so many different kinds of coaching logs out there. If you were to look at any resource that Elena Aguilar puts out there, Diane Sweeney, Jim Knight has some tools. There are some that I've uploaded here too. You just want to have some kind of log that documents all of these things. So something like this is pretty simple, where you're just going to define on what days am I doing what with the teacher, and what does it involve? Are we looking at data? Am I modeling a lesson? Are we just meeting? Is it observation and feedback? You know, putting all of that in there, documenting the follow-up. But this, you can see you're agreeing on it beforehand, because the coach, it shouldn't really say principal, it should say teacher. You're agreeing to it ahead of time, right? So everybody knows what to expect. Something else, sometimes people have these like fill in the blanks for a coaching agreement, like our coaching cycle will last, you know, how many days, we'll meet on, you know, whatever days, during what block of time, but clearly defining what that could look like, and then even having a schedule. So, you know, on Mondays, I'm going to observe word study, and on Tuesdays, we're going to co-plan whatever else. And the more specific you can be, the more successful your coaching cycle will be, because it'll be so clearly focused and everyone involved will know what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Here's another coaching agreement that has the work plan that talks about, you know, what work is going to come out of the coaching cycle, like a report, logistics of meeting, when, how often, where, things like that. Again, you don't even have to use a form. You can use whatever you want. Very often this is what my schedule looked like, because I worked with so many different teachers, but you can see, not that you would necessarily want to use that, but in a day, you can see the different kinds of tasks that you would do. You would observe, you would facilitate a team meeting or just participate. You might reflect, you might do some PD, you might collaborate. You have to do your own preparation. You have to have time to do all of those things. So this just kind of is a nice snapshot of what potentially your own day could look like, just to kind of give you an idea. Okay, so for that coaching cycle, remember, it is an agreed upon partnership. This is not you driving the bus, you're driving it together. You can bring a lot of resources and influence to the table, but it has to come from you and that teacher that you're coaching. It has to be anchored in the standards, especially if you're working towards student-centered coaching, has to involve this or be anchored in the standards. And ultimately, the focus has to be on student learning. At some point, if you are at the point with a teacher where it's just you're building trust and relationships, that's okay. Just know that down the road, what your goal is to ultimately bring that teacher along to be able to look at their students together. So that's kind of the coaching cycle in a nutshell, if you would, or if you will. There are these 7 core practices kind of associated with just student-centered coaching. Really important. The first practice is setting a standards-based goal, like I just said, for coaching cycles. Again, everything has to be anchored in those standards. We're going to come back to that one in a minute. The second, unpack the standards into student-friendly learning targets. Now, the teacher should have already done that. If they're planning well, they should have unpacked the standards, and then all their learning targets for every lesson should be based on standards and written in kid-friendly language. Some teachers need help with that, need coaching around that. If they do, that's a little teacher-centered coaching. But to get them to student-centered, this has to be in place. The third, using student evidence to co-plan instruction. You cannot plan without assessment data, right? We know this. This is the instruction assessment cycle. You have to have data to plan a lesson. So it's important if you're coaching, especially if you're going to model the lesson, it has to be based on student evidence or data. The fourth, organize coaching through coaching cycles. Again, it's not meant to be forever. It's meant to be in a certain amount of time with a very specific goal, and we'll come back to that one too in a minute. The fifth, co-teach with a focus on effective instructional practices. When you're co-teaching, it's really important that we're always modeling and encouraging the use of best practice. Otherwise, we're not really helping that teacher build their repertoire of best practices, right? The sixth, measure the impact of coaching on student and teacher learning. We have to make sure that our coaching is doing what we want it to do. We have to measure the effectiveness of it or the impact of it. We can't just say, oh, that cycle's done, check and move on. We have to figure out, how did we impact the teacher and how did we impact the students? So the reflection piece is so important. And then the last, it's important to partner with the school leader. I will say this. There are principals out there who want to meet with the instructional coaches and say, tell me what you're seeing. Tell me how so-and-so is doing. It is so important to not get into the trap of kind of like tattling. You know, Billy Bob is, not really entering into coaching with me. He is being really resistant. I see this in his classroom. What that does is it will mean you will never have a trusting relationship with that teacher again, and probably most teachers in that building. The coach is not meant to take information about what they see and tell it to the principal. It's more about looking at big picture and trends to get the principal's support. So if you're seeing things like, I really could just, if I could have one day where I could sit with the 3rd grade team and really hash out word study. They need some really good PDM word study. If you have that relationship with the principal, then the principal would say, that's fine, I'll get subs, they'll get release time. And you can work with those 3rd grade teachers. That's what you need from your school leader. You need to build that culture of support for the coach, not using the coach as a pawn to spy in classrooms. Don't ever fall on that trap. This is a coaching sheet I happen to use at one point when I was coaching. So you can see, here was my cycle. The focus was pretty tight. Intervention lessons for standard. This was from Common Core, not Next Gen. 4th grade standard 3. That was something that came out of the 3rd grade state test data that was weak. So now that the kids were in 4th grade, the 4th grade team, the PLC, decided we need intervention lessons around this standard. So I had said, all right, team, let's work from October to December on this goal. So it was meant for the whole class because it did come from that state test data, which is right here. The goal was that students will describe characters, major events, and how characters react to major events. That's language right from the standard, right? So this is clearly based in a standard. We had decided as a PLC that the instructional strategy we were going to use was interactive read aloud and really well-written guided questions to work toward that goal. We decided ahead of time as a PLC what coaching practices would be used. I was modeling in every fourth grade classroom. Then we moved on to co-teaching in every classroom. We analyzed student work together. I probably should have checked off collaborative planning. I don't know why I didn't, because if we co-taught, we had a plan together. That's weird. And then ahead of time, we had to decide, well, how are we going to track progress? So this team happened to have weekly reading journals. So they were going to craft questions all around the standard so we could track student progress in their journals. And there was a particular graphic organizer, a character event graphic organizer that they enjoyed using. So after every new text, they were using that same graphic organizer because it really showed whether or not students could get to this depth of thinking. And we tracked that over time. The dates probably should have been more specific than that, just to be more clear in the coaching cycle. And every teacher down here had their own teacher learning goal. Even though they were all working towards the same goal for students, some of them wanted to work more towards crafting better questions. Some of them wanted, I remember one in particular wanted to work on like management within an interactive read aloud. Another one actually wanted to work on how she reads aloud. She felt like she was a little too monotone and read too quickly that students weren't following along. So each teacher could have their own goal, but still anchored in that standard. And all the students' goals were anchored in that standard as well. So again, so many ways to document, but you can see how everything in this coaching cycle was documented in this one document. Thinking about using data within student-centered coaching, remember, in student-centered coaching, we have to focus on data analysis and using information to make good decisions because everything is based on the standards, right? And how students are doing in accordance to the standards. Well, we have to collect data to know that information. So data has to be what informs your coaching conversations. It can't be, oh, I think I saw this. Or so often teachers will say something like, none of my students understand this skill or this strategy. Well, when they say things like that, is it really none of them? Can you put, and then you say things like, well, can I see the data that shows that? And then you'll kind of come to, the teacher will say, oh, it wasn't all of them, it was like 4 of them, right? Everything has to be anchored in data to be valid. Things like benchmarks, interims, progress monitoring, CFAs, whatever the school or the district chooses to use, those are great places to start, but we want to go deeper because all of those kinds of things measure a lot. We want data that's more in the moment, like literally what can a student do on the spot. We want that data to be descriptive. So it's not just telling, can they do it or not, but like, are they miscuing? How? What miscues do you see the most? Are they not comprehending? What level of questioning are they not getting? It's really important to be that specific. And we want all of that data to be formative, like from formative assessments, as teachers should be doing in every lesson anyway. So we want to work from things like student work samples or anecdotal notes, whether they're yours or the teacher's, or any other kind of performance assessment. So not necessarily a formal benchmark or progress monitoring assessment, but any kind of formative performance assessment, because those we know are the most authentic anyway. So the focus then for all of this is to think about what makes learning visible and how can we use that information to plan the next lesson. Think in terms of how to prepare for a coaching setting or session. What kind of data should you be asking for from a teacher that shows you, or that shows you learning is taking place? And then how do we use that information to plan the next lesson? All right, so if we can revisit our learning targets, hopefully you can discuss the differences between those 3 types of coaching, teacher-centered, student-centered, and relationship-driven, and when and why you might engage in each one. You are always going to engage in all 3, but hopefully you'll always be striving for that student-centered coaching. At this point, I hope you can describe the coaching cycle and are starting to feel a little bit more comfortable getting ready to engage in one. And then can you articulate the impact of student-centered coaching?